The storm had arrived without warning, a tempest fierce enough to shake even the oldest oaks. Eli Turner stood in the doorway of his old farmhouse, gazing out over the rain-soaked fields with a sense of unease. It wasn't just the storm that unsettled him. It was the years of battle, years of fighting the land he had inherited from his father and his father's father before him. The land had been a friend and enemy in equal measure. But tonight it felt like it had finally won. Eli's grip on the doorframe tightened, his knuckles white against the weathered wood. The storm lashed at his skin as he stepped outside, the cold rain soaking through his clothes, but he barely noticed. His mind was elsewhere, on the fields, the land that he had poured every ounce of his energy into. For decades, he had labored here, believing that with enough persistence, the soil would reward him, the crops would thrive, and the farm would prosper. But now, with his crops failing and the ground turning to dust under his feet, it felt as though the land was rejecting him. The winds howled, whipping the rain in every direction. His heart mirrored the storm in its own chaotic, swirling tempest. There had been years like this before, but none that felt so complete in their destruction. None that had so thoroughly torn through his spirit. Eli's thoughts drifted back to his childhood, when he would run through these same fields, his father's voice calling him home for supper. Back then, everything felt possible. The land had been fertile, full of promise. The soil had given, the crops had flourished, and there was always something to celebrate. Even in the toughest seasons, there was hope. But now, as he looked over the same fields, the harsh reality of droughts, floods, and market crashes gnawed at him. His father's wisdom, the kind that had sustained generations of Turners, had begun to feel hollow, like the words of a man who didn't understand that the world had changed. The rain that was now pouring down, for all its ferocity, couldn't cleanse him of the deepening sense of despair that clouded his mind. It was as if the land had taken on a life of its own, taunting him with its harsh beauty and daring him to try once again. Eli wanted to fight back, to push through, but the fight felt different now. It felt like he was battling the very earth he had once loved. The storm wasn't just the weather. It was his soul in turmoil, his heart torn between the past and the uncertain future. Behind him, in the distance, the faint glow of a lantern flickered from the farmhouse window. His wife, Grace, would be waiting for him inside. She had always been his anchor, the steady presence in his life when everything else seemed to be slipping away. Yet tonight, even her warm smile and the comfort of her embrace felt distant. How could he explain to her that he was ready to give up? That the farm, the legacy of the Turners, was beyond saving? As he stood there, staring at the chaos unfolding around him, a memory surfaced. One that felt like a sign, a haunting reminder that perhaps he was never meant to let go. It was his grandfather's voice that whispered in his ear, "The land's not yours to own. It's yours to tend to. Respect it and it'll respect you. But don't expect it to be easy." His grandfather had been a man of few words but infinite wisdom. It was his voice Eli had heard in his head when he took over the farm at 22. The same voice that had driven him to wake up before dawn every day, year after year, never asking for rest, always working the fields as if they would last forever. Now, after so many years of toil, Eli wondered if his grandfather had been right all along. Perhaps the land didn't want to be tamed, and perhaps he had been foolish to believe that persistence alone could overcome nature's will. The winds gusted, bringing with them a fresh torrent of rain, stinging Eli's skin. His clothes were soaked through now, but still he didn't move. He was rooted to the spot, torn between the urge to fight and the desire to surrender. The land had given so much to him over the years, but now it seemed to demand more than he had to give. Just then, there was a knock at the door. It startled him, snapping him out of his reverie. He hesitated before slowly turning toward the farmhouse. Who would be out here at this hour in this weather? With a sense of reluctance, he stepped back into the house, his boots sloshing against the muddy floor. Eli opened the door, the harsh wind momentarily rushing in with the figure standing in the doorway. It was Thomas, a young man who had come to work for Eli nearly 5 years ago. Thomas was soaked to the bone, his face pale but determined. His blue eyes locked onto Eli's, full of energy, full of a hope that Eli could scarcely remember having. "I'm sorry to interrupt, Mr. Turner," Thomas said, his voice strong despite the storm. "But I couldn't wait. I've been thinking all night. I know things are bad, but we can't give up now." Eli stared at him, the weariness in his eyes speaking volumes. Thomas, who had never known the Turners before Eli, who had come to the farm with a naive optimism, was asking him to believe in something that Eli could hardly grasp anymore. "What do you mean, Thomas?" Eli asked, his voice gruff from both the storm and the years of worry. "Regenerative farming. There's a way to heal the soil, to bring it back. We can't just abandon the land." "There's still a chance, Mr. Turner," Thomas insisted, his voice unwavering. Eli blinked, as if hearing the words for the first time. He had heard the term before, of course, had heard whispers of new methods, new ideas that promised salvation for struggling farms. But they all seemed so theoretical, so far removed from the hands-in-the-dirt, tried-and-true practices that Eli had grown up with. And yet, standing there in the storm's aftermath, Eli couldn't deny that a flicker of something that resembled hope, stirred within him. "You believe that?" Eli asked, his voice quieter now, as the storm raged around them. "I do," Thomas said simply, his gaze never wavering. "I've been reading about it, about what we can do. The land can heal. It's just a matter of working with it, not against it. I'm willing to try if you are." For a long moment Eli said nothing. His mind raced, torn between what felt like common sense and the gut-wrenching fear of failure. But something about Thomas's sincerity, his unshakable belief, stirred a memory of that younger, more hopeful Eli who had first taken the reins of the farm, believing that no storm was too strong, no drought too long. He had learned so much along the way, but in all that learning, he had forgotten one essential truth. The land was as much about hope as it was about work. Finally, Eli spoke, his voice steady despite the weight of his words. "All right, Thomas, let's try." And as they stood there, facing the storm together, the storm outside didn't seem quite as fierce. It was still raging, still wild, but for the first time in a long while, Eli felt the smallest spark of something he had almost forgotten. Hope. The morning after the storm, the land lay in a state of quiet devastation. The rain had stopped, but the earth was still heavy, and the air was thick with moisture. Eli stood in the middle of the field, his boots sinking slightly into the sodden ground. It was the same field where he had watched countless seasons pass, but now it felt alien to him, changed, scarred, as if the land itself had reached its breaking point. His eyes swept over the flooded patches of soil and the limp remnants of crops, the vestiges of dreams once vibrant and alive. His heart sank, as though the storm had stripped more than just the crops. It had stripped his hope. But as Eli took in the ruin around him, he was not alone. Thomas was there, beside him, as determined as ever, standing with his hands on his hips and his eyes fixed on the horizon. The young man's gaze was sharp, scanning the land not for what it had lost but for what it could still become. Eli turned to him. "I don't know where to begin. It all feels too far gone, Thomas. The soil's ruined and the crops are gone. What's left?" Thomas nodded, not fazed by the gravity of the situation. "It's not over, Mr. Turner. It's just a setback. We've got to start slow and be patient. There's a way to bring it back." Eli's brow furrowed as he listened to Thomas speak, still unsure. "I've been at this for years, son. I've tried everything. The land is tired. Maybe it's time I'm tired too." Thomas looked at him with quiet intensity. "You've worked this land for a long time. You've always been about hard work. But there's more to it now. Regenerative farming isn't just about hard work. It's about working with the land. We can help it recover, but it'll take time." Eli's gaze dropped to the ground. The weight of all those years of labor, the long hours, and endless effort made it difficult to imagine anything could heal this broken land. Yet, there was something in Thomas's words that stirred something deep inside him, a faint trace of the hope he had almost lost. After a long pause, Eli sighed, wiping the sweat from his brow, despite the cool air. "All right, I'm with you, but this better not be some fool's dream. Let's see what you've got. The first few days were exhausting. They worked from dawn until dusk, Thomas explaining the new principles of regenerative farming as they went. The process was a far cry from the methods Eli had known all his life. Instead of merely planting new crops, they focused on healing the soil. Thomas showed Eli how to plant cover crops. Plants like clover, rye, and vetch that would protect the soil from erosion, fix nitrogen in the ground, and slowly build its fertility. The idea was simple, but the labor involved was anything but. Eli couldn't help but feel a sense of frustration as he followed Thomas's directions. His hands, though experienced, felt clumsy as they worked to plant the cover crops. It felt wrong somehow, too gentle, too patient, for a man who had spent his life fighting the land, pushing it to produce with every ounce of strength. "Take it slow, Mr. Turner," Thomas would say gently whenever Eli became impatient. "We're working with the earth, not forcing it." The words gnawed at Eli's pride, but as the days went on, he began to understand. It wasn't just about planting and moving on. It was about nurturing. It was about respecting the land cycles and about feeding it with the right kind of care. And in doing so, the land would eventually give back, just not in the way Eli had expected. As the weeks wore on, Eli began to notice the toll the work was taking on him. He had never shied away from hard labor, but regenerative farming was different. It wasn't just physical labor, it was mental and emotional. There were moments when Eli questioned the very foundation of his beliefs. Every time he looked out at the crops that had yet to show any significant growth, the doubts crept in. It seemed as though, despite their best efforts, the land was still rejecting them. One afternoon, as they worked to dig trenches for water drainage, Eli's back seized up. He had felt the aches before, years of bending over, lifting, and toiling, but this was different. This was a sharp, biting pain that made it impossible to continue. "Mr. Turner?" Thomas's voice cut through the air, sharp with concern. "Are you all right?" Eli groaned, clutching his lower back. "I'll be fine," he lied. "Just give me a moment." But Thomas wouldn't let up. "You're pushing yourself too hard. Let's take a break." Reluctantly, Eli agreed, sinking onto a nearby rock. His breath labored. He had never been one to show weakness, but now, in this moment of physical vulnerability, he was forced to confront his limitations. His body, once strong and capable, now felt old and worn, a reflection of the farm itself. The years of hard labor had taken their toll, and the fight to restore the land was only making it worse. Thomas sat down next to him, handing Eli a water bottle. "You've been working this land for decades. It's going to take time for both of us, your body and the soil, to heal. But we're in this together." Eli looked at Thomas. His face creased with frustration. "How much longer can we keep this up? How long before the bank comes calling? Before I have to give it all up?" Thomas gave a small, encouraging smile. "It's not about how long, Mr. Turner. It's about what we're doing now. You taught me that the land's not just soil and crops. It's about the effort we put into it. We keep at it. And eventually, the land will respond." Eli felt a flicker of something, an old, familiar spark, deep inside him. Maybe he wasn't ready to give up just yet. Maybe the fight wasn't lost after all. It was 2 months into their efforts when something unexpected happened. One morning, as Eli walked through the fields, he noticed that the cover crops had begun to sprout. The rye and clover, once small and fragile, were now a thick carpet of green. The soil, which had once seemed so barren, was now beginning to show signs of life. For the first time in a long while, Eli felt a glimmer of hope. He crouched down, running his fingers through the soil, feeling its texture. It wasn't perfect, but it was alive. It was working. "Look at this," Eli said, his voice rough with emotion. "It's actually working." Thomas stood beside him, a proud smile on his face. "It's just the beginning. This is how we start the healing process, by giving the soil time to rest and regenerate. Soon we'll be able to start planting again." Eli stood slowly, his knees creaking as he took in the sight of the growing cover crops. For the first time in months, he felt something inside him stir. A feeling he had nearly forgotten. Optimism. The storm, the struggles, the doubts, they hadn't broken him. And maybe, just maybe, the land hadn't been broken either. Despite this small breakthrough, the road ahead was still long. There were still many days of hard work, and the farm was far from being out of the woods. Yet, for the first time in a long while, Eli felt like he was part of something larger than himself. It wasn't just the farm that was being restored, it was his belief in it, in the future, in the possibility of recovery. He had come to understand that the land, like him, needed time to heal. There was no quick fix. But as they continued to work to tend to the soil, Eli realized that maybe the real lesson wasn't in the immediate results. It was in the slow, steady work of renewal. And so, despite the challenges that lay ahead, Eli felt a renewed sense of purpose. The farm wasn't just his inheritance. It was his responsibility. He wasn't done yet. The storm may have broken the surface, but the roots of the land and his hope were stronger than ever. The winds of doubt came quietly at first, like a whisper, but soon they grew louder. The seeds of skepticism were planted long before Eli and Thomas had finished planting the cover crops. But now the surrounding community, the neighbors, fellow farmers, and even friends, began to take notice. Their whispers began to grow into loud voices, casting shadows over Eli's newfound sense of hope. It started with small comments, casual remarks from the men at the local hardware store, all of whom had been farmers their entire lives. Their families' roots deep in the same soil that Eli had worked so tirelessly to cultivate. They knew the land, they knew the seasons, and most importantly, they knew what it took to survive. And in their eyes, what Eli was doing was a foolish gamble. I heard Turner's gone and joined the New Age farming. One of them, Jim Ferguson, said one morning as Eli entered the store, looking to pick up some supplies. Eli could feel the weight of the words hanging in the air, like a physical blow. "What do you mean by that, Jim?" he asked, trying to mask the sharpness in his voice. Jim gave a knowing chuckle, shaking his head. "You know, all that talk about regenerative farming. It's just a joke. This land doesn't need pampering, Eli. It needs hard work, sweat, and the right seed. The old way still works. It always has." Eli stood there, his heart thumping in his chest. For a moment he was back in the field, the weight of the soil heavy in his hands, the sweat, and the ache in his muscles. The pressure to continue in the old way was like a weight on his shoulders, pulling him back into the past, into the way he had always known. The next day, the whispers grew louder. His neighbor, Mark Davis, a man who had always been more than willing to lend a hand, came by to offer his opinion. "Eli," he began, the tone of his voice trying to mask a hint of concern. "You've been at this for a while now. I've seen the cover crops, but what about the real crops? The ones we feed people with? It's not like you to take a break from planting the staples. These new ideas, I just don't know." Eli's jaw clenched. He had tried to explain to Mark and everyone else that the cover crops were part of a bigger picture, part of restoring the soil, ensuring the long-term health of the land. But the skepticism in Mark's eyes was clear. It was the same look many of the older farmers had given him. "You're losing your grip on reality, Eli." "I'm just trying to do what's best for the farm," Eli said, his voice tight. "And the land. It's not easy, but it's necessary." Mark didn't say anything for a long time. Then he sighed. "I hope you know what you're doing, Eli, because you're not just risking your farm, you're risking your future." As the weeks went on, Eli began to feel the weight of the skepticism and doubt, not just from others but from within himself. The land was slow to heal. The new crops were still fragile, struggling to grow. And while the soil showed signs of recovery, it was far from the bounty of years past. Every time Eli walked the fields, a part of him questioned whether it was worth it. Maybe they were too far gone. Maybe the land would never return to its full glory. Perhaps the old way, hard work, tilling the earth, using the chemicals and methods that had been passed down to him, was the only true way forward. The cracks in Eli's resolve deepened when Grace began to voice her concerns, too. She had always been his rock, his partner through thick and thin. But now, she too was beginning to question the path they had chosen. "I see you out there every day, Eli," Grace said one night, as they sat at the kitchen table, the dim light of the oil lamp casting soft shadows on her face. I see you working yourself to the bone, barely getting any sleep. But it's starting to feel like you're losing more than just your energy. You're losing yourself. This farm is falling apart, and I don't know how much longer we can keep going like this." Eli's heart tightened at her words. He had tried to hide the toll that the farming had taken on him, physically, emotionally. But Grace saw through it all. She always had. "I'm doing what's right for us, Grace," he said, his voice filled with an edge of frustration. "This is the future of farming. It's just slow and hard, but it's worth it." Grace looked at him, her eyes filled with concern. "And what if it isn't worth it? What if this doesn't work? You've put everything into this. Your time, your sweat, your heart. But what if we're just digging ourselves deeper?" The words stung more than Eli was willing to admit. It wasn't that he didn't understand her concerns. It was that he didn't have any answers. The path ahead was uncertain, and despite his best efforts to convince himself that he was doing the right thing, there was no guarantee that the farm would ever recover. Every day, as he worked alongside Thomas in the fields, the growing tension between hope and doubt left a bitter taste in his mouth. And then the real blow came, the storm of doubt that would test him more than anything before. A group of neighboring farmers, led by Mark and Jim, showed up at the farm one afternoon. They didn't come to help. They came to warn. "We've been talking," Jim said, his face stern. "The drought's been tough on all of us. But you're taking this too far, Eli. The community's been talking about it, about how this newfangled method is only going to sink your farm. You're in trouble. And if you keep going down this road, we can't help you when you fall." Eli felt his chest tighten at their words. It wasn't just the land that was questioning him. It was everyone he had trusted, everyone he had shared his struggles with. They were turning their backs, leaving him alone to fight an impossible battle. "You don't understand," Eli said, his voice rising. "This isn't just about me. This is about the future, about saving the land. I can't just keep doing what we've always done. We can't go on pretending like nothing's changing." "You're making a mistake," Mark said, shaking his head. "You're gambling with the farm's future. And if you go under, we'll all be left to pick up the pieces." The words hit Eli like a physical blow. His mind raced. Was he really risking it all? Was he leading Thomas and his family down a road that had no way back? The question lingered in the air, heavy and suffocating. He had fought for this, fought for the farm, for the land, for hope. But now, in the face of so many doubters, so many voices urging him to give up, Eli wasn't sure how much longer he could hold on. That night, Eli sat alone on the porch, staring at the darkened horizon. The winds had picked up again, the faint howl of the storm reminding him that the battle he was waging wasn't just against the land. It was against everything he had known. As he sat there, lost in thought, Thomas came out to join him. The young man stood silently for a while, then sat beside Eli. "Looks like the whole town thinks we're crazy," Thomas said quietly, his voice carrying a mixture of frustration and acceptance. Eli nodded, his hand resting on the worn wood of the porch. "Maybe we are. Maybe it's all too much. I don't know anymore, Thomas. Maybe the old ways are right. Maybe I'm just fooling myself into thinking that there's a way to fix this." Thomas didn't respond immediately. Instead, he simply sat beside Eli, staring at the fields, the weight of the moment pressing down on them both. Finally, after a long silence, Thomas spoke again. "We can't control the past, Mr. Turner. We can only decide what we do with today. And right now, today is about rebuilding. The storms are going to come. The droughts will keep coming. But that doesn't mean we give up. We adapt. We fight. We believe." Eli looked at Thomas, and for the first time in weeks, something in him shifted. It was as though the weight of doubt that had been pressing on his chest had finally loosened. Maybe this wasn't about what the neighbors thought. Maybe this wasn't about whether the old ways or new ways were right. Maybe it was simply about believing in something, in the land, in the work, in the future. "I'm not giving up," Eli said quietly, his voice steady with newfound resolve. "Not yet." The last few weeks had been harder than any Eli could remember. The weather was against them, either too much rain or not enough. And the farm seemed to grow heavier with every day that passed. Every corner of his life was burdened by the crushing weight of doubt and failure. Eli's hands, which had once moved with confidence through the soil, now trembled from exhaustion. His body felt as if it had aged a decade in the last year, each day a constant reminder of the toll that this fight was taking. His relationship with Grace had grown tense, the quiet moments filled with unspoken words, the doubts hanging like a cloud between them. Every time she looked at him, he could see the worry in her eyes. She wasn't sure they could keep going like this much longer. The other farmers, those who had once been his friends, his peers, had grown more vocal in their criticism. They no longer kept their concerns to hushed tones behind his back. No, they stood on his porch now, their voices sharp with disdain, their faces etched with disbelief. Jim Ferguson came over one afternoon, his face drawn tight with frustration. "Eli, this has gone too far. You're digging yourself a hole, and I won't stand by and watch you lose everything. The land can't be saved like this. We all know it." Eli could feel his stomach knot with each word. It wasn't just the criticism. It was the finality in Jim's voice, the certainty that Eli had lost, that everything he was trying to do was a fool's errand. "I'm doing everything I can, Jim," Eli said, his voice low, barely holding on to the calm that had sustained him until now. "You can't just force the land to give what it doesn't have anymore. This is the future. This is the only way forward." But Jim was unmoved. "Your future is slipping through your fingers, Eli. You're going to ruin everything." Eli watched as Jim turned and walked away, leaving him alone on the porch, the last of his confidence slipping with every step the man took. Inside, the house was quiet, too quiet. As the days dragged on, Eli could feel himself nearing the edge. The weight of everything, the doubts, the failures, the constant whispers, was pulling him under. He couldn't see any way out. There were no signs of growth in the fields, no miracle harvest waiting to emerge from the soil. The idea of giving up had begun to creep into his thoughts, a temptation he couldn't ignore. It was one thing to fight for a cause you believed in, but it was another thing entirely when every sign, every failure pointed to the fact that maybe it was all in vain. One evening, Eli stood in the middle of the field, staring at the fading light of the sunset. His body was aching, and his mind was weary. He had worked all day, but the land felt more distant than ever, like a stranger he could no longer reach. The crops were still struggling, the soil stubborn and unyielding. The weight of the world pressed down on him, heavier than any harvest he had ever known. Every piece of advice from the old ways echoed in his mind. "Go back to what you know. It's not worth it, you're wasting time," and he felt himself beginning to crack. "Maybe they're right," he whispered to himself, his words lost in the wind. "Maybe I've been wrong all along." Just then, a voice from behind him pulled him from his thoughts. "You're not wrong, Mr. Turner." Eli turned to see Thomas standing there, looking younger than ever. Yet there was a fire in his eyes that hadn't been there before. The confidence in Thomas's voice cut through the fog of Eli's doubt like a beam of sunlight breaking through dark clouds. "I don't know if I can keep going," Eli confessed, his voice low, his shoulders slumped in defeat. "I don't know if I can face another day like this." Thomas walked toward him slowly, as if understanding the depth of Eli's struggle. He didn't rush to offer a quick fix or a comforting platitude. Instead, he stood next to Eli in silence for a few moments, just letting the weight of the moment settle. Then quietly he spoke. "You don't have to face it alone," Thomas said simply. "I'm here, and so is the land. It's not about fixing everything overnight. It's about putting in the work. You've shown me that, and it's not something I'll forget." Eli looked at him, the young man standing with so much certainty in his stance. "I'm scared, Thomas. What if this doesn't work? What if we're just wasting our time?" Thomas shook his head. "It's not a waste, Mr. Turner. Nothing worthwhile is ever easy. I don't know what the future holds. But I do know this, we've come too far to stop now. You taught me that." Eli felt something stir in his chest, a flicker of the fire he had once had, the fire that had driven him to work this farm year after year. Maybe he wasn't finished yet. Maybe he wasn't ready to give up. The next morning, Eli awoke with a sense of resolve. He didn't know where the strength had come from, but it was there, burning quietly inside him. Despite all the signs pointing to failure, despite the fear, despite the doubt, he knew one thing. He wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. He and Thomas went out into the fields early, working side by side, with a quiet intensity that neither of them had felt before. They dug deeper, carefully planting more cover crops, working the soil with a renewed sense of purpose. Thomas explained more about soil health and how every step they took was a small part of the puzzle. It wasn't about the immediate results, it was about the long-term recovery, about laying the foundation for a future that neither of them could see just yet. Eli didn't speak much that day. He didn't need to. The quiet labor was enough. They worked until the sun began to set, and as they stopped to take a break, Eli's eyes fell on the horizon. He thought about all the years he had spent fighting the land, pushing it to its limits, trying to make it give more than it had. But now he realized it wasn't about forcing the land to produce. It was about coaxing it back to life, working with it, respecting it. And in doing so, maybe they could build something even stronger than before. Later that night, as they ate a simple meal together at the kitchen table, Grace looked at Eli, her eyes filled with cautious hope. "I saw the way you were working today. You seemed different. What happened?" Eli took a long breath and met her gaze. "I realized something today. This farm, it's not just about crops and fields. It's about us. About believing in something, even when everything seems lost. And I'm not ready to give up on it. On us." Grace's eyes softened, the worry easing a bit from her face. She reached out and took his hand, squeezing it gently. "I don't know what the future holds, Eli, but I believe in you, and I believe in this farm." As the weeks passed, the signs of recovery became harder to ignore. It was subtle at first, a patch of soil that was richer in color, a small cluster of crops that began to show the faintest hint of green. The cover crops, which had once been thin and weak, began to grow stronger, their roots reaching deeper into the soil, pulling nutrients from the earth. The earth was healing bit by bit. Eli would walk the fields every day, his eyes scanning the land, and though the recovery was slow, he saw it now, the promise that had once seemed so distant. It wasn't instant, and it wasn't easy, but it was happening. Slowly, methodically, and that was enough. One day, Thomas came running to him, a grin splitting his face. "Mr. Turner, you have to see this." Eli followed him, heart pounding until they reached a small patch of the field where a few crops had finally sprouted. Strong, healthy, vibrant green. For the first time in months, Eli felt his breath catch in his chest. It wasn't much, but it was enough. It was a sign that the land was responding, that the work was paying off. The tipping point had come, not with a thunderous roar, but with a quiet promise. The farm wasn't saved yet, but it was no longer on the brink of collapse. Eli had taken the first step in a journey he wasn't sure would ever end. But one thing was certain: the fight wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Farmers' struggle and hope. A motivational story of perseverance and recovery in the field.